Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about chemical doping and stability in organic semiconductors. So before I go ahead, I just wanted to acknowledge my team at the University of Arizona Material Science and my collaborators in the chemistry department, also the NSF funding agency and the SLAC National Lab where we did a lot of experiments in collaboration with. So why organic semiconductors? So advantages of these kind of materials is that they're low cost, they can be flexible and they're solution processable, so they can be printed like paper, and they have chemical tailorability. So I can take up a chemical molecule and say I want these properties and go to a synthetic chemist and say, hey, help me make these molecules, and they can help me do that. So chemical tailorability is a big advantage of organic semiconductors. With all these great advantages, they also have a lot of challenges, and that's what my work is based on. So they have lower conductivities compared to their inorganic counterparts. They have extremely complex microstructure, which can be a little difficult to manipulate for device level work. And they are prone to degradation. So, understanding their degradation mechanisms, understanding how they conduct the electricity, and what their complex microstructures are like is very important to be able to use the advantages that they also possess. So that's what I will be focusing on, is the challenges and how we can understand these mechanisms better. So three things. One main thing I'll be talking about is the doping mechanism on organic semiconductor doping systems. I'll touch upon the stability and degradation with time, as well as the thermal degradation of these materials. Um, so the material system of choice that I have is what I used was the P3HT, that's poly 3-hexyl thiophene, in two forms. So if you look at this, it's called a regio-random P3HT, which is amorphous in its microstructure, and this is a regio-regular P3HT, which is semi-crystalline. So this is my organic semiconductor system, and then I use FOTCNQ, which is a small molecule, to dope these materials and to understand their properties. So there are two main kinds of doping mechanisms: chemical doping and electrochemical doping. While we've worked on both of these mechanisms, my work right today will focus more on the chemical doping of these materials, which is a little more fascinating uh, in terms of its complexities. So when you think of a organic semiconductor, why do they have a bad electrical conductivity? So when you think of an inorganic semiconductor, these are like highways where cars are going really fast, and they have great conductivity because these highways are so well structured. So their microstructure is very crystalline and well understood. So it's easier to manipulate the electrons in these systems. But when you think of organic semiconductors, they are like a bumpy road. Their microstructures are not very well understood, and they are not very crystalline in most cases, and so they have poor conductivities. So it's important to understand the microstructure to be able to then understand the electrical properties of these systems. They are all very interconnected. So an inorganic semiconductor has mobilities of about 8 times more than a organic polymer system would have. So they're really highly conductive materials, the inorganic systems, while organic systems are low in conductivity. So understanding the doping mechanisms becomes even more important if I want to push their conductivities and mobilities to a higher limit. So, yep. So basically, to control transport in a doped organic semiconductor, we need to understand this relationship between electronic microstructure properties. They're very intimately connected at a molecular level. So it's also important to understand their chemical structure, and that's kind of what I'll be focusing on. Is there are n number of ways to probe these systems using FTIR to TRMC, depending on what scale you want to look at. My focus today will be on three major characterization techniques. To understand the microstructure, we use GVAX, which is an X-ray scattering technique. To understand the electronic structure, we use absorbance spectra, and to understand its chemical structure, we use the FTIR. So now, so if we look at regioregular P3HT, it has a microstructure that's called semicrystalline, and depending on how you process it, it is either its orientation changes. So the my processing technique created a semicrystalline pi stacking face on big kind of a microstructure. And so if you look at the cartoon on the right, it's basically, if P3HT is one of these rectangles, this is how they're going to stack in solution processed mechanism that I chose to use. And then when we characterize it using GVAX, this is the kind of structure we get. And why we call it semicrystalline is because of these bands being so diffused. So if it was a crystalline structure, these would be like really minute dots. The scattering would be very focused. So like I said, the crystallinity can be edge on or face on, and depending on whether it's edge on or face on, it has different directions of transport and different conductivity. So, for example, a transistor would benefit with an edge on kind of a microstructure because of transport along the pi lamella structure is in this direction, while a solar cell that needs to conduct these electrons in the perpendicular direction would benefit more from a face-on kind of a microstructure. So this can be manipulated using the solvent of choice and the way you process these materials. And then, as I was saying earlier, P3HT or our regioregular P3HT is a semicrystalline molecule. So while it has crystalline domains, which can be either edge-on or face-on, it also has amorphous domains that are a lot more difficult to characterize. But they do exist in the same system, and we need to be mindful of the fact that these are semicrystalline systems with amorphous and crystalline aggregates. So, if we try to look at the conductivities of these, if we try to improve the conductivity of these polymers, when I start to dope, this was done via GVAX, where we were looking to understand how does the microstructure change as I change the conductivity of the system by doping it with the molecule called F40CNQ. So I can increase by highly doping my system, I can increase the conductivity from 10 power minus 4 to almost 1. Um, um, so almost by like 4 to 6 times higher than what the undoped material is like. But then when I start to look at the microstructure, what we see is that the crystalline domains change. So as I keep doping, as I increase the dopant content, it diffuses into the in-plane direction. And then as I go higher in doping, I can actually start seeing in the GVAC spectra, I can actually start seeing an evolution of another peak, which we know, which means that the FOTC NQ anion is now going in and sitting in this in plane direction of the P3HT. So this is what is happening microstructurally and electrically, right? It's increasing in its conductivity values, and the anion is now going into the crystalline structure. But what happens to the charge transfer state? And that's what we were trying to understand, is what happens in terms of the interaction between the P3HT and F40CNQ anion. So, in literature, in organic semiconductors, there are two kinds of charge transfers possible. One is called the integral charge transfer, where there is a single electron movement between the organic semiconductor and the dopant molecule as you add the dopant into the system. And then the other is called the trap state, which is a partial charge transfer state, where this is more of a hybridization mechanism where your dopant is not completely, there is no single transfer of electron, but a partial charge transfer. So it forms an intermediate state called the CPX state, which is a partial charge transfer state. Ideally, this is not something you want. This is in your system. You want a complete charge transfer so you can have more efficient increase in your conductivity. So as we probe the systems and we use UV vis, there are very prominent signals for these two materials, and that's why we chose them. Is so P3HT. So if you look at the red curve, it has both P3HT and FOTCNQ. So the P3HT signal is around the 540, 500, 560 nanometer range, which is this black one. And then the FOTCNQ charge transfer in P3HT is FOTCNQ minus, basically is in this range of about 700 to 900. This signal is what we're looking for in FOTCNQ. And then, yeah, here you go. And then the neutral FOTCNQ has a lower wavelength of about 400 nanometer. So these are the signals we are kind of tracking on the UV vis. And then if you look at the FTIR, also it has very straight signals, and in fact, the cyano stretching region in the FOTCNQ is so sensitive that you can in fact calculate the degree of charge transfer. So this was some work that was done by the Salzman group in a while back. And so we use this to calculate the charge transfer of these states um, as we start doping the system. So so we take regioregular P3HT, which is semicrystalline, and dope it. And mostly in literature, what was seen that is that it only forms ICT states. And so this was shown with multiple UV vis absorption and FTIR spectra. However, you can, if you change the processing condition, you can change the charge transfer state. So the same P3HT FOTCMK system can form either a partial charge transfer state or an integral charge transfer state. This is what was studied mostly until about 2018. And then when our research came in, this is what we saw in fact was that these two states coexist, that they exist together. They're not independent of each other. Again, it is dependent on your processing condition, but in our work we saw that both of these states coexist. And how we saw that was using a combination of UV vis and FTIR spectra. So we looked very closely into the FTIR spectra, and what we saw was that in fact the ICT state has a CPX state in it as well. So as you increase the dopant in the system, you can see changes in this blue peak. And then we fit the FTIR spectra, and what we noticed was that in a semicrystalline RRP3HT, the CPX state is about at zero point 0.8. The degree of charge transfer is about zero point 0.8. So while free charge carriers of the integral charge transfer state exist, there are also trap states in the same system. And it's important to know that these trap states exist so you can then look at how you can manipulate them better to create more efficient charge transfer states and more efficient doping conditions. So kind of like everything in one place, right? Like what is happening to the system? I'm putting in a dopant called FOTCNQ. I'm increasing the conductivities, but I'm also adding this FOTCNQ in the semicrystalline region, right? And then chemically, we see that these two states coexist. So now our next question was, we know semicrystalline region has these anions in it, but then the next question is, what is happening in the amorphous region, right? Because the amorphous region is not independent of the semicrystalline of the crystalline domains in this polymer. They coexist as well. So if FOTC and QICT and partial charge transfer states coexist, and the amorphous and the semicrystalline and the crystalline regions coexist, we wanted to understand their interactions independent of each other. So how is the partial charge transfer state interacting with the amorphous or the crystalline region, and how is the integral charge transfer state doing the same? So while we can't directly look at the amorphous regions, what we can have is we can use the regio-random P3HT. It's not energetically identical to the amorphous region in the regio-regular P3HT, but it's still a purely amorphous form of P3HT, but chemically the same. So it's an interesting model system to understand how this amorphous region is going to now behave with doping the system. So what we saw was that as we dope the system, we see the ICT states exist, but it is dominated by the CPX state. And charge transfer degree of charge transfer is also a little less than the in the crystalline region. So these hybridized P3H3 and Q, FOTC and QCPX states are formed, and it's the charge transfer is different. The If you look at the spectra, they're very different from what the your regular P3HD look like. Then we started trying to understand these electron energy states and their density of states and how they overlap with each other. And what we saw was very interesting. Was that what we saw was the So if you look at this red color region, this is the density of states calculated using the CV voltammetry. And what we saw experimentally calculated these two, and this is a theoretical FOTCNQ minus simulated density of state. So these calculated density of states, we see these regions which overlap with the FOTCNQ, and this overlap happens in mostly the crystalline region of the regular P3HD. And as we go lower in energy, we move into the amorphous domains, and there is less and less overlap with the density of states of the FOTCNQ. And this kind of tells us that the crystalline and amorphous regions, since they overlap differently, it's very possible that the crystalline regions are the ones that show that have more energetical influence on the integral charge transfer, while the amorphous regions have more influence on the partial charge transfer. And this is purely based out of the energetic overlaps of these systems. So, okay, now we've kind of understood how the doping is working. So, I'll just touch upon how some parts of how stable these systems are. So, in terms of stability with time, what we saw, and I'll go over this very quickly since I think I'm running out of time as well, is what we saw for stability of the system, and there's more work that has been done on this since, was that as I said, these systems are very easy to degrade. So we saw a fall in the doped system as they age. The conductivity of these systems go down when they're stored in like a light and ambient environment. But the moment I move them to a glove box, that is, it's stored in dark and inert environment, we see that the stability is better than the light and ambient environment. And this has a correlation to the CPX and these ICT states as well. What we saw was uh, this loss in conductivity is observed simultaneously with increase in CPX states. So as the molecule system ages, more and more CPX states were being formed, reducing the efficiency of these reducing the conductivity of these systems. So that there was less ICT in the system and more CPX in the system, which is an interesting phenomena. That means that CPX state is less stable. So that was some work we did with stability with time, and then we also looked into the thermal degradation of with these molecules, because when they have to go into a device system, the device always heats up. The charge transfer, charge electrical so when it's in a device form, it has contacts and metal contacts where there's going to be a loss in heat transfer of heat energy as well. So it's important to understand how they degrade with time. So what we saw was, depending on the dopant concentration, there was a degradation in the conductivities of both the so even pure P3HT in fact has a degradation uh, with just increasing with annealing, because this comes from its change in its crystalline form. But what is interesting to see is that as you go from in a higher dopant concentration regime, as you go from uh, annealing higher as you go to higher annealing temperatures, you see a fall in electrical conductivity, but this never comes back to that of PrP3HT. So it's what is a de-doping mechanism, which can in fact be used for like thermoelectrics, because you can manipulate the conductivity of these materials with temperature. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on these materials more, but it's good to understand how they behave. So what we see in air is this de-doping mechanism. Is this happening due to change in microstructure, change in transfer states, or is there a chemical degradation process happening? So we looked a little more further into it. We chose one dopant concentration of about 0.09, and then we went ahead and looked at their spectra again. So what we saw was that as you dope the system, the ICT state starts to merge into one single spectra. So we see a loss in FOTCNQ anion state. What we also see is in the GVAX is that the loss in the second peak. So I see a peak for the FOTCNQ minus leaving the crystalline structure. So what we think is happening is that as you dope the system, the crystalline structure is changing, and the anions in the system are leaving the crystalline in-plane structure that they sat in before. So they're thermally being pushed out of the crystalline domain. So the in-plane microstructure returns to pure RRP3HT. So if you look at this, right, as I go to 120 degrees, this is where my in-plane microstructure is, and at 120 degrees room temperature, this is where my P3HT is. So it's almost returning to its original crystalline form, but the conductivity is never returned to their original form. So that means there is still dopant in the system. So now where is this dopant and what is it doing? It's not in the crystalline region anymore. So we looked at the UV-Vis and FTIR spectra, and what we saw was an emergence of this extra peak as we increase in temperature. So we see loss in the FOTCNQ, we see movement in the crystalline domains. So if you look at the movement of this peak, from the black peak is the doped peak, and then the orange peak is the 120 degrees peak, you see a shift in this P3HT uh, um, uh, aggregate. This is a P3HT aggregate peak. So that means energetically it's now in a different form. And chemically, we see an emergence of this extra peak. So there is a chemical reaction happening inside the system, and we worked with our the spectroscopy experts in the chemistry department, and what we saw was that in fact this thermal degradation is happening via the formation of a new species called the HFOTCNQ minus at higher temperatures, and this is also leading to the loss in conductivity. So there's still ongoing research on this mechanism, but like a big picture is that what we think is happening is the hydrogen from our P3H3 system is being taken by the FOTCNQ to form this new molecule um, of HF4TCNQ. And so now that we know, if we understand the mechanism, we can then work on counteracting on it, right? So I can now go in and design a molecule that, since I know that this is the hydrogen that is causing all this mayhem, I can design a molecule that does not have this hydrogen. So this is some work that's ongoing and has been done with other teams as well, is where they have substituted the hexyl thiophene hexyl with a glycol a molecule which has no hydrogen. So the team is looking into how some initial work has been done on when we actually heat it, we don't see this formation of this. Sorry, let me go back. This new peak formation can be inhibited, but that's ongoing research, and I won't be going upon that. But kind of this is where we are at. So. To conclude, right, it is important to understand the molecular, electronic, and chemical interaction of these species, to understand how the structure phase and chemical phase diagrams of these entire data set exists, and that is kind of the work that's still ongoing. Now that we know there are three species, there's a CPX, ICT, and HF40CNQ formation, and that we know we have different kinds of in plane crystalline structures, polymorphs, and we also have the de-doped polymorphs at higher temperature, where it's not complete, it does not have that 40 same q, but it's in a now a different crystal structure. So the work is ongoing to understand these phase diagrams a little better, to understand the system better, so we can then form better better chemical systems. So that was most of my talk. Were there any questions?